Pariah, Chapter 1. Jaren awoke with a shout, the all-too-familiar terror clawing at his soul with frozen talons. His breath came in ragged gasps, his heart raced, his nightshirt was drenched in sweat and clung to his body like a death shroud. His thin blanket was thoroughly entwined about his legs like some kind of crushing woolen serpent. He cried out and kicked at it, struggled free of its grasp, and heaved it aside. Another terrified shout escaped him as he scrambled backward over the side of the bed to land rather unceremoniously on the floor. Bright spots exploded in his vision as the impact nearly knocked him unconscious. He vaguely realized that he was in his room and safe, albeit awkwardly positioned. His legs were still atop the bed, and his nightshirt was bunched around his chest. He groaned and rolled onto his side. The mercilessly cold floor pressed against his flank and jolted him awake. He lay there on the hard planks, relishing their cold tangibility and collecting his wits. The room swam into focus and replaced the visions of terror that had flooded his dreaming mind. The pale bluish glow of the twin moons fell across the room from the single narrow window set high on the wall. A flitting shadow darted at the edge of his vision, and his head snapped to the left as he quickly braced himself on his arm. He looked about, peering into the deep shadows by the door and beneath the bed, searching for... what? There was no danger in this room, save for that posed by a sharp blow to the head. A dream, no matter how terrible, was only a dream after all. Or was it? Rise and face the threat, then, he chided himself. He rolled onto his stomach and, bracing himself alternately on the plaster wall and rough wooden bed frame, rose to his feet. He took a stumbling step toward the dressing table. A wave of dizziness overtook him, and he quickly sat down on the edge of the bed until it passed. Must have nearly broken my own skull, he thought, rubbing at the soreness that was sure to become a sizable knot at the back of his head. What in the waste was I dreaming about? He could not recall. In truth, the memory of it was fading fast as he sat gasping and blinking on the bed. Flashes and glimpses of a place of darkness, a place that was so far removed from the waking world as to be utterly alien, flickered before his mind's eye. Falling, always falling, flailing and trying to scream, but unable to draw breath in the alien place where there was no air to breathe, no form to anything, no solid shape. He could smell damp rot, the stench of death, could feel a hot mist that tasted of blood, but somehow he knew that what he sensed was only his mind's interpretation of the place, as if everything were so different that his feeble senses could not properly grasp his surroundings. There was so much more in that blurry, shapeless pit than sight or smell or even touch could possibly glean. But the place itself was not the true cause of his terror. It was that thing. It was nothing his eyes could see, nor his ears hear, but his heart, no, his very soul quaked at its presence. It was everywhere and nowhere, everything and nothing, formless and yet vast beyond imagining. It was before him, behind him, within him, and yet he could not identify it. It followed his every move, watched as he fell, and he could feel its mirth at his plight, knew that it was toying with him as a cat toyed with a wounded mouse until becoming bored enough to kill it. Worst of all, it spoke. Profane and maddening words drifted to him upon a voice that could be heard, yes, but also felt, as if the thing spoke not only to his ear, but to his very bones. Calm yourself, you fool. He gave himself a sharp slap to the face, then shook his head to clear the memory. This was the 5th night this 10, and the 3rd night running that he had come awake screaming in terror. The increasing frequency of the nightmare was beginning to take its toll on him. It was not lack of sleep that worried him. He had long ago found that he performed better if he slept no more than half the night. These damnable nightmares, however, seemed to be having a profound effect on his mind. Just yesterday, he thought he heard the fiendish voice of that thing speaking to him from the shadows of a half-open cupboard in the scullery. He had stood there, jaw agape and trembling, until someone had pitched an empty roasting pan in through the door. The ear-splitting clatter of its graceless landing in the wash basin had drawn from him a terrified scream, which had in turn drawn boisterous laughter from his fellow servants. He stood and looked warily about the room. Nothing spoke from the darkened hearth. No baleful eyes glowered at him from the window. He giggled nervously. These dreams would drive him mad if he could not somehow stop them. He shook his head slowly, chiding himself again for his senseless fear. He pulled the sweat-soaked nightshirt over his head and hung it on its peg by the headboard, then stepped toward the low dressing table across the room from the bed. A large wooden bowl filled with icy water stood atop it. He splashed the near-freezing water on his face and over his bare shoulders, gasping as the shock brought him forcefully, completely awake. The cold water compounded the chill in the air and drew a shiver from him. Jaren blinked the sleep from his eyes as he crossed the small room to the hearth in the corner. He knelt and placed a length of firewood atop the glowing coals. The wood quickly caught alight, and he knelt upon the fired clay bricks at its edge to warm himself as he offered up his morning prayers. It was best to greet the goddess at first light, as her eye peeked over the edge of the world, but Jaren did not believe she would begrudge him this breach of protocol. He was, after all, more faithful than most, despite having ample reason to turn away from her altogether. "That's pride talking. You'd best silence it." He smiled. His conscience always reminded him of the truth, and he knew that as long as he heard it, he had not lost the grace of his goddess. He bowed his head and continued his prayers, thanking Vindra for her continued protection and concluding with a fervent petition for undisturbed sleep. He opened his eyes and gazed into the dancing flames. The world was always most peaceful in this hour, the short time before dawn when everyone was just waking and pondering the day ahead. "Enough dallying you lay about," he thought with a sigh. He rose and took stock of himself. He felt, above all else, tired. His brain was pitifully slow and foggy. His head ached. He turned back to the dressing table and pondered his reflection in the small mirror that hung above it. What he saw only confirmed his suspicions. He looked as though death had slept beside him last night. The long, pale scar on his right cheek, a badge bestowed upon him by a failed bowstring some 3 winters past, was especially visible today, contrasted as it was by dark eyes that were sunken and bruised. His dun-colored and unruly hair was in sore need of a trim. The faintest hint of worry lines already creased his brow. "Growing old before my time," he thought. He stretched out his arms, and his eyes fell to the livid scars that covered them. The irons hiss, and at first he feels nothing. He is cold, detached, disconnected from the leering faces and jeering voices that punctuate the sibilant song of the bailiff's glowing instruments. This cannot be real, he thinks. He is convinced that this is some horrible nightmare. It must be. Who would do this to a child of 14 winters? The irons hiss. They are merciless, uncaring, as is the bailiff who employs them. But they are different in one respect. They are hot. They are glowing, incandescent, the antipode of the bailiff's callous, glacial heart. Why then, he thinks, his eyes swimming, do I feel so cold? The irons hiss, and the coldness spreads. Its frigid tendrils quest forth from his heart like the first seeking roots of a sprouting seed. Further it creeps, setting its frozen grip on his chest, and before long he is shivering despite the nigh intolerable heat of the bailiff's branding fire and the stale, oppressive midday sun. The coldness frightens him. He shies from it, tries to flee its grasp, but it is as unyielding as the rack and manacles that bind his body. It surges into his mind like a colossal serpent smashing up from the abyssal depths of a lightless, frozen sea. It shatters his resistance with contemptuous ease. It wraps itself around his mind and drags him down into the dark, where there is no pain, no hate, only the sweet bliss of empty numbness. The smell reaches his nostrils, and the pain begins. It is more than he ever believed it would be. It is no mere physical hurt, not the sting of a hornet or the bite of a thorn. It is a scourge to his very soul, a barbed lash that flays his heart open as the reality of his new life takes hold. He is nothing to these people, less than nothing, below contempt and barely above notice, and this insufferable torture is how they will let that fact be known. This knowledge amplifies the physical pain to an agony so pure and refined it expands his awareness. His breath catches in his throat, his arms strain against the bonds of the rack, his body screams out for release, escape, safety, away, get away. He cannot. There is no escape from this, the worst cruelty in his young life, but not the last, as he will find soon enough. Time passes, how much he does not know. Spittle flies from his lips as his breath comes in ragged gasps, His head rolls in the yoke, and his eyes flutter open in time to see the brands descend again, charring the fleshy inside of his forearm, slowly, deliberately, in careful little taps. And the hissing fills his ears, the smell fills his head, and the pain spreads relentlessly, mercilessly. He closes his eyes. Singed hair, scorched flesh, the smells become entwined and indistinguishable. His bladder lets go. He does not care. He is lost. The pain and the cold and the scent of his burning flesh drive him inexorably toward the edge of insanity like hounds on the hunt. And now the pain has spread to his hands, and the hounds will not stop. The pain will not stop. The bailiff and the insults and the laughter and the cruel, smug people in the crowd are enjoying his agony. They are reveling in it, and he knows he must surely go mad. The brands go silent. The pain ceases to spread, but it does not lessen. Rough hands fall upon his forearms and wrists and begin to rub and grind, and the pain explodes again. He chokes back a scream as another scent, a pungent and oily miasma of ash and something caustic, stabs a rusty spike into his forehead. They are skinning me, he thinks. They are skinning me like a fresh kill, and I am going mad. He falls further. More time passes, and more pain. It is different now, though. It is distant. He is desolate, detached. The coldness, his only ally, the horrifying Gestalt Leviathan of his defiance and will, surges forward and banishes the pain as easily as it had taken him. He opens his eyes. Jaren gasped, his teeth clenched in rage as he fought back the empty coldness within him. The flames of his barely controlled fury slowly melted the frigid nothingness away as he breathed in a slow, steady rhythm. 4 winters, Jaren. It's been 4 winters since you were marked. That did not matter. Even now, after so much time, the memory still sent him to the same desolate, frozen place, and the only thing that brought him back was near murderous rage. He filled his mind with visions of the sun, the warm stones of the garden in summer, the lighted hearth in the corner. It was strange, but the very thing that caused him so much hurt was now the only thing that would bring him back from the cold and calm his fury. He slowly relaxed, and when he looked into the mirror again, he saw droplets of sweat standing out on his brow. "Vindra, grant me peace," he whispered. He took several deep breaths and relaxed. It will always be this way, he thought stoically. He lifted his arms and examined the brands in reflection. The sight of them still lit a spark of anger in his heart. They had branded him, but that was not enough. The marks were meant to be clearly visible, and to ensure this, the bailiff had rubbed a stinging mixture of wood ash, alum, and safflower dye into the fresh wounds. The resulting scars were an intricate, deep red scrollwork of Kelran, the esoteric language of the order. In truth, they were quite handsome to behold. The old bailiff had treated Jaren's arms and hands like a virgin canvas, and took great pains to capture every subtle nuance, every looping whirl and accent of the original text in exact detail. He had then encircled the entire work with a complex series of stylized knots. The brands had slowly changed into a mess of weeping scabs that he treated with a stinging red ointment. It was, in truth, based on the very same dye the bailiff had initially scoured into the burns. The smell of it always took him back to the rack and yoke, back to the taunts of the crowd and the sting of the brands. But treat them he did, because he clearly remembered the bailiff's final words before they released him from the yoke. "Don't you go thinking this gets you clear of your work, Pariah. Be in the fields as one of your kind should, but you'd best not let the marks take an infection, lest you be back here in a week and I'll have 'em off you for sure." He was not proud of the marks. He might have been, had he been allowed to choose to wear them. He would gladly have accepted a passage from the orisons of purity, or the orisons of will, but these marks were forced upon him as a constant reminder of his place in this world. They gave even complete strangers cause to shove him aside, spit on him, shout at him, berate him. No, he was not proud of the marks. He was proud of the fact that he had not given any of those sneering, jeering bastards the pleasure of hearing him scream. "Dwell not on that which cannot be changed." He shook his head and pushed himself away from the table, then stooped and reached into the shelf beneath. Heavy tan trousers, a light cotton undershirt, and a wool tunic of servant's green were all he would require. The day would be cold, but he would be working the kitchens, He dressed quickly, pulled on his light boots, checked the spark screen on the hearth, and left the room. The smell of roasting bacon and aromatic herbs filled the hall. The flow of air through the estate's elaborate system of tunnels and passages somehow carried the scent from the kitchen all the way to the servants' quarters, something Jaren could never quite explain. His empty stomach, incapable of so much as caring for an explanation, gave a grumbling, surly growl. He had missed supper last night, thanks to a run-in with one of the estate watchmen. Breakfast would be most welcome. The flickering sconces and deeply stained oak trim on the lath and plaster walls flew by as he jogged toward the servants' bath chambers. As he passed through a simple arch, the low ceiling of the dormitory gave way to the high, vaulted dome of a vast, brilliantly lit rotunda. Jaren slowed as he entered the room, admiring the marble columns, the mosaics adorning the walls, the polished granite floor, and high above, the glass and wrought iron of the dome proper. He had been a servant of Alethir House for the past 4 winters, and spent all 4 within its walls, yet he still marveled at its grandiose architecture. Iron braziers cast in the form of diving hawks hung from the iron dome frame on long brass chains, and large oil sconces encircled the room, making this a place of light and warmth no matter the season. Fortunate am I to live in such a place, he thought, once again praising Vindra for what blessings she had seen fit to give him. Try as he might, Jaren could never quite grasp the motivations of the master of this estate, guardian wielder Thale Iralam. By right and by writ, Thale, as a guardian and devout follower of the order, should not have even allowed one such as Jaren to set foot on his lands, much less live under such a splendid roof. Thale was a perfect example of the dichotomy of men. He personally ordered and directed the branding of every pariah on his estate, including Jaren. Afterward, though, as if in an effort to atone for their suffering, he allowed them to go on living in the grandest house of the River Plains. They were servants, true, but they were allowed to walk among Terrians freely, worship as they pleased, even keep weapons. The servants of most other estates were forced to fend for themselves, and, in the worst of them, lived in wretched squalor on the outskirts of distant fields. And all in the name of elitism and fear, he fumed. None of the misery he and many others like him had endured throughout the years would have ever come to pass, had it not been for one brilliant and arguably insane man, Rillandas of Blackshore. A radical but wildly popular order priest, Rillandas had risen to power and died decades before Jaren was born. He was considered a visionary by many of his contemporaries, and his fame only increased after he published The Occlusion. The work was intended as an observation of the hollow, and attempted to explain their strange nature through allegory involving the void and the evident. It was the first document to ever make the comparison between the unreachable minds of the hollow and the all-devouring nothingness of the void. After his death, debate raged for years over the intent of the occlusion. It was not until several of Rillandas's less tolerant disciples rose to power in his wake that the Vindran order, citing Rillandas's work, began the branding and persecution. Oddly, there were no order laws regarding the hollow. The tradition of branding had not come about until after Rillandas's death, and Jaren could find no written record of the first pariah to have been marked. The whole practice was the product of institutional fear-mongering as far as he was concerned, and was probably adopted at the end of the Second Telandarian War, so the common people would focus their anger on something other than their corrupt and failing monarchy. Of course, there were those willing to bend the rules, though this was not without risk. Jaren supposed that Lord Thale's perceived blasphemy would never have been tolerated, were it not for his nigh untouchable station as a sept guardian. Jaren reached the center of the rotunda and stopped. This room served as a hub of sorts, connecting the guard barracks, the servants' quarters, and the service tunnels that led to the main house. A large circular stone basin in the center of the room served as a cooling fountain in the summer. The servants drained it each year at first frost and filled it with earth, changing it to an indoor garden, which served as the winter home for Lady Soraya's prized rose bushes. The groundskeepers prided themselves on their ability to make the roses bloom year-round. Yes, there are places much worse than this, he thought, as he walked slowly around the temporary garden. The bath chambers were on the opposite side of the room. He continued past the fountain and stopped short of a heavy oak door. These chambers were used by all members of the staff, men and women alike. Jaren recalled memories both thrilling and unpleasant about storming into the room unannounced to see none other than Lissa, the beautiful young daughter of the head groundskeeper, standing in front of the full-length mirror opposite the door wearing nothing but her own skin. Jaren's perspective had granted him a glorious view which left nothing to the imagination. The sight of her hair, as red as the roses in the fountain, cascading down the smooth, pale skin of her back, was as fresh in his mind now as it was last spring. Of course, the memory had come at the cost of numerous lumps and bruises, both from Lissa and her enraged father, but he considered them a fair trade. He had often contemplated repeating the offense in hopes of seeing her again, but always decided against it. There were, after all, more stoop-backed old crones in the servants' quarters than nubile young beauties. Spying one of them nude would likely cost him his sight. He knocked loudly and cracked the door open. No voices called back. He entered. Like the rotunda, the dominant feature in this room was a central stone basin. This one, however, was recessed into the floor and filled with steaming water that fed through an ingenious system of heated pipes. Half a dozen full-length mirrors stood around the room, and a wooden cabinet to the right of the door held towels and other bathing sundries. The door to the latrines stood to Jaren's immediate left. He pushed it open. The short hall contained 8 doors, 4 to either side. Jaren found an empty closet and stepped in. He untied the points of his trousers. The memory of Lissa's lithe form brought a wistful smile to his face as he relieved his aching bladder. That girl is absolutely gorgeous. His reverie was rudely interrupted by the sound of a man loudly breaking wind in the closet adjoining his. The shameless offender giggled and called out, "Oh, there's a fine good morning, hey now!" Raucous laughter sounded from another stall. Jaren finished his business, smiling in mirth. He secured his trousers and went back to the main chamber, where he stopped to scrub his hands and face in the steaming pool before heading off to the kitchens. The rotunda was slowly coming to life as sunrise approached. Loud voices barked orders from the guard barracks. Jaren could hear people rousing and shuffling about throughout the complex, and they would want their breakfast soon. He took up a slow jog toward the service tunnels. He had just slipped through the wide archway and rounded the corner into the main tunnel when he collided with a bulky, armored form. Before he could offer apologies, or even determine the man's identity, the back of an armored gauntlet smashed into his jaw. Stars bloomed before his sight as he stumbled into the hewn stone wall. He felt something warm running from his mouth and knew he was bleeding. "Know your place, servant, and give me the road!" That voice. Ymir. This will get ugly, Jaren thought as a strong hand took hold of his tunic and spun him around. "Will we have a pariah?" Ymir's gravelly, mocking voice carried breath as foul as a vulture's. "Do you know the penalty for assault on a house aspirant, you hollow cur?" Jaren resisted the urge to spit blood in the pig's face. He swallowed and spoke softly. "My apologies, aspirant. I did not see you." "Didn't care to look, more like." Ymir shoved him roughly into the wall. His head cracked off the stone hard enough to make his ears ring. Ymir's voice seemed to come from the next room as the pain in his already throbbing skull intensified. "Next time, open your pitch-blasted eyes, or I'll gouge 'em out of your skull." He chuckled smugly and tromped off down the hall. Jaren leaned against the wall, blinking his eyes and bleeding. The bastard, he thought, thankful his thoughts could not be read. He cursed his luck. Of all the arrogant whore sons to be up and about at this hour, why did it have to be Ymir? Anyone else would have just chided him, maybe shoved him aside, but that one, he went to great lengths to hurt people, especially the pariahs he encountered. Jaren was certain that the sadistic lout wanted him dead. He had long ago lost count of the bruises and bumps Ymir had dealt him since his arrival at House Alethir. The fact that Ymir was Lord Thael's only son merely added to Jaren's fury and confusion. How had the acorn fallen so very far from the oak? He spat blood on the cobblestone floor. "Vendra, grant me patience," he thought, as he pushed off the wall. He wiped at the blood on his face as he shook with rage. Had that been a Terrien, Jaren would have pounded him bloody. It would not be the first time, either. In his experience, some Terriens would seek out pariahs to kick when a foul mood took them. The Terriens of House Alethir, however, had long ago learned to steer clear of Jaren, as he could, thanks to some rather unorthodox tutelage during his formative years, easily hold his own against most attackers in a contest of fists. Some still tried, however, mostly while in their cups, and Jaren was occasionally forced to remind some drunken fool that not every pariah would accept abuse. The wielders, however, even the most junior among them, were untouchable. To strike them was to invite death, either at the hands of the offended wielder or an order bailiff. In the case of Ymir, the sentence would likely be carried out by Thale Iralam himself. Old Murda would not be happy about this. She would be even less happy if he tarried any longer. He banished the thoughts of vengeance from his mind. There will come a day, he thought, when they push me too far. I cannot accept this lot forever. He blinked the tears from his eyes and jogged off down the widening tunnel. This was the main artery of the estate, connecting the storage areas and living quarters on the north side of the hill with the main house on the south. Lord Thale had ordered the construction of the vast underground network to increase the efficiency of the staff, with the fortunate side effect of added discretion. It was possible to move from nearly any point of the estate to any other without seeing the light of day. This gave the illusion that Lord Thale's staff was practically non-existent, when in reality it was one of the largest in the river plains. Jaren often compared the estate and its tunnels to a gigantic ant mound, lifeless on the surface, but all too alive and even a little dangerous within. The tunnels were always bustling with activity, regardless of the hour. Nearly everything that moved within House Alethir came through this passage. Jaren passed washmaids hauling clothes, laborers hauling furniture and supplies, even two men struggling under the weight of a pot filled with what appeared to be hot pine tar as he made his way along its length. The tunnels were a veritable beehive from sunrise to sunset, and even then the activity continued. Most people could not fathom the amount of logistical support required to keep an estate the size of House Alethir running. As a staff servant, Jaren knew only too well. Alethir was a military estate, and, as such, was designed with tactical advantage in mind. Every portion of the sprawling complex was accessible from any other portion within a few hundred paces, and every tunnel ultimately led to one place, the dining hall. That made the kitchens the beating heart of Alethir, which in turn made the kitchen servants some of the hardest working in Thale's employ. It's better than grubbing dirt in the fields, Jaren acknowledged. He slowed as he turned through a narrow, brick-lined arch into the cavernous expanse of the main kitchen. That's the end of Chapter 1. Thank you for listening.